On a cold November morning, a phone that was never supposed to be found suddenly lit up. It had been buried beneath layers of dirt and silence for over a decade, sealed away with a story everyone believed was already finished. The case had long been closed, filed away in a system that had stopped asking questions. But in that quiet moment when the screen flickered back to life, it carried something no one was prepared for. A message, short, direct, terrifying in its simplicity. Don't trust him. And just like that, everything people thought they understood about that night began to fall apart, because for 12 years this wasn't just a disappearance. It was a secret carefully kept, hidden in plain sight by someone no one ever thought to question, someone close, someone trusted, someone who had been there from the very beginning. For years her family searched for answers that never came. Friends held on to memories, replaying conversations, wondering if they had missed something important. Investigators followed leads that led nowhere, chasing fragments of a story that refused to come together. And slowly over time the world moved on. Her name faded from headlines, her case became another file in a long line of unsolved mysteries, and the silence grew heavier with each passing year. Until now. Until that phone turned on, carrying with it a voice from the past that refused to stay buried. A voice that pointed not to a stranger in the dark, but to someone standing in the light all along. Because the truth about what happened that night was never lost, it was protected, carefully, quietly, hidden behind routine, behind grief, behind a version of events that everyone accepted because it was easier than asking the right questions. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, and when they do, they don't just reveal what happened, they expose who people really are. This is the story of a woman who vanished without a trace, and the one clue she left behind that would take 12 years to be heard. A story about trust, about silence, and about the moment everything changed, because the man everyone trusted was hiding her last secret. And what that message revealed would change everything forever. She vanished without a trace. No body, no weapon, no answers. One moment Emily Carter was living a life that to everyone around her felt stable and predictable. The next she was gone, leaving behind a silence that no one could explain. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no indication that anything had gone wrong inside the place she was last seen. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life and disappeared into nothing. And for 12 years, that is exactly how the world understood it. A disappearance without resolution, a story without an ending. But that version of events only existed because the right questions were never fully asked. What really happened that night? Why was her phone never found until now? And more importantly, who was she trying to warn with that final message? Because don't trust him was not just a statement, it was a decision. A choice made in what were likely her final moments, directed at someone she believed needed to know the truth. And that raises a question investigators could never ignore once the phone was recovered. If Emily Carter knew she was in danger, then who put her there? For years, the investigation moved in circles, revisiting the same timelines, the same statements, the same carefully constructed narrative that never quite broke apart. Detectives followed procedure, examined evidence, and spoke to the people closest to her, including the man everyone trusted. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. No confession, no physical proof, just a lingering sense that something about the case didn't sit right. And over time, that feeling was buried beneath paperwork, assumptions, and the slow fading of public attention. But when the phone was finally discovered, it didn't just reopen the case. It challenged everything that had been accepted as truth, because buried inside that small device was not just a message but a timeline, a sequence of moments that no one had seen before, conversations that had been deleted, calls that had gone unnoticed, details that didn't align with the story that had been told for over a decade. And suddenly the case was no longer cold, it was active, urgent, and far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Every answer seemed to uncover another layer, another inconsistency, another reason to question the people who had once been cleared. And at the center of it all was that message, simple, direct, but impossible to ignore, because it suggested that Emily Carter didn't just disappear, she was trying to tell someone something before it was too late. And by the end of this story, one detail, just one, would make even experienced detectives question everything they thought they knew about that night. But before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily Carter was 34 years old, a nurse by profession and the kind of person people relied on without hesitation. She showed up on time every time, not just at work but in life. Friends described her as steady, thoughtful, and quietly strong, someone who didn't seek attention but always earned respect. She worked long shifts, often putting others before herself, and still found time to call her family, check in on friends, and maintain a routine that rarely changed. It was that consistency that made her disappearance so difficult to accept. People like Emily didn't just walk away, they didn't leave without a word, without a plan, without a reason. She wasn't the type to disappear. Her life, at least on the surface, followed a pattern that felt familiar and secure. Early mornings, late shifts, quiet evenings at home. The kind of rhythm that doesn't raise questions. The kind that makes everything seem under control. And for a long time, that's exactly how it appeared. No signs of chaos, no visible cracks, nothing that would suggest that anything was out of place. But routines can be deceiving. They can hide things, smooth over tension, make silence look like peace. And in Emily Carter's case, that silence would later take on a very different meaning. At the center of her personal life was her husband, Daniel Carter. He was known as calm, composed, and dependable. The kind of man neighbors greeted without hesitation, the kind of person who blended into the background in a way that felt reassuring. He held a steady job, kept to himself, and when Emily disappeared, he was the one who spoke to police, who answered questions, who stood in front of cameras asking for help, to most people. Daniel Carter looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a concerned husband searching for his missing wife. Then there was Mark Reynolds, a close friend of the couple. He had been around for years, someone who knew both Emily and Daniel well enough to be trusted, well enough to be present during important moments in their lives. Mark was supportive, always available, always willing to step in when needed. But there was something about him that didn't quite sit right with everyone. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing you could point to directly. Just a feeling, subtle and easy to ignore, the kind that gets pushed aside because there's no clear reason to question it. From the outside, everything looked normal, stable, safe, the kind of life people don't look twice at. But sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones closest to home, the ones hidden behind familiarity, behind routine, behind people you think you know. And in the months leading up to her disappearance, there were small signs that something in Emily's world had started to shift. Neighbors would later recall hearing arguments, not constant, not loud enough to draw immediate concern, but enough to be remembered once everything changed. Moments of tension that didn't match the image of a quiet, stable home. Friends noticed that Emily had become more withdrawn, less open than she used to be. Conversations that once felt easy became shorter, more guarded. It wasn't dramatic, nothing that would have triggered alarm at the time, but it was different. And different in hindsight can mean everything. One detail stood out more than the rest. A conversation Emily had with a close friend just weeks before she vanished. It wasn't long and it didn't seem urgent in the moment, but the words stayed. If anything happens to me, look closer. At the time it sounded like stress, maybe frustration, something said without deeper meaning. But after she disappeared, those words became impossible to ignore, because they suggested something most people hadn't considered. That Emily Carter may have known more than she ever said out loud. And if she knew something, the question becomes why she didn't tell anyone. Or maybe she tried, just not in a way that was understood until it was too late. Because people don't usually leave warnings like that without a reason. They don't speak in uncertainty unless there's something they can't fully explain or something they're afraid to say directly. Looking back, those small moments began to connect. The tension, the distance, the quiet change in behavior. None of it seemed significant on its own, but together they told a different story. A story that suggested Emily Carter's life wasn't as simple as it appeared, that beneath the routine there was something unresolved, something building, something she may have been trying to make sense of herself. No one knew, she already sensed something was wrong. November 14th, 9:42 p.m. That was the last time anyone saw Emily Carter alive. The night had settled in with a steady rain, the kind that blurred streetlights and softened the edges of everything outside. Inside her home, nothing appeared unusual, no sudden movement, no raised alarms, just another evening that, to anyone looking in, would have seemed ordinary. But moments like that can be misleading. Because sometimes the most important events happen quietly, without drawing attention, without leaving behind the kind of evidence people expect. And on that night, something changed in a way no one could immediately see. Earlier that evening, Emily had been on the phone with a close friend. The conversation wasn't urgent, nothing that would have suggested danger, just a familiar voice on the other end of a routine call. But there was a shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Her tone changed, a pause, a hesitation, as if something in the room had caught her attention, and then without warning the call dropped mid-sentence. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. At the time, it seemed like a technical issue, a lost signal, something easy to dismiss. But that moment would later become one of the most important pieces of the entire case, because it marked the exact point where everything stopped. The timeline that followed was unclear, filled with gaps that no one could confidently explain. The last confirmed movement, the last known contact, all led back to that moment. After that, there was nothing, no messages, no activity, no indication of where Emily Carter had gone or what had happened inside that house. It was as if time had simply paused, leaving behind a question no one could answer. Hours later, Daniel Carter reported her missing. His account was calm, structured, consistent with what someone might expect from a concerned husband. He explained that Emily wasn't answering her phone, that she hadn't returned, that something felt wrong. Law enforcement responded quickly, entering the home, examining the space, looking for anything that might explain her absence. But what they found raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken furniture, no evidence of a struggle. Everything was in place untouched, almost as if nothing had happened at all. Her belongings were still there, personal items left behind in a way that didn't suggest preparation or intent to leave. It didn't match the pattern of someone choosing to disappear, and it didn't match the pattern of a typical crime scene either. It didn't look like a crime scene, and that was the first red flag, because in cases like this, the absence of evidence can be just as telling as its presence. A space that is too clean, too undisturbed can indicate something deliberate, something controlled, something planned in a way that avoids leaving anything behind, and that possibility, though not confirmed at the time, lingered in the background of the investigation. As detectives began to piece together the events of that night, they relied heavily on statements, timelines, and the limited information available. Daniel Carter remained cooperative, answering questions, providing details, maintaining the same version of events. There were no immediate contradictions, nothing that would justify suspicion beyond standard procedure. And without physical evidence pointing in another direction, the case began to stall. But what investigators didn't know yet was that Emily Carter had already left behind a clue. A clue that would remain hidden for years, buried alongside the truth, waiting for the moment it would finally be discovered. And when it was, it wouldn't just add to the story, it would change it completely. In the days following Emily Carter's disappearance, the search moved quickly. Law enforcement canvassed the area, spoke to neighbors, retraced her last known movements, and followed every lead that surfaced. Her name appeared in local news, her photo circulated across communities. And for a brief moment, it felt like answers might come. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, that momentum began to fade. No body was found, no weapon was recovered. And most importantly, her phone, the one object that could have revealed her final moments, was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the most critical piece of evidence had been intentionally removed from the story. Months turned into years and the silence became permanent. The case, once active and urgent, slowly lost priority. Detectives were reassigned, new cases took focus, and Emily Carter's disappearance became one of many unsolved files sitting in storage. Her family continued to ask questions, holding on to the belief that something had been missed, that somewhere within the details there was an answer waiting to be uncovered. But without new evidence, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. The official narrative remained unchanged. She had vanished and no one could explain how or why. But over time, small inconsistencies began to surface. They weren't obvious at first, nothing that immediately pointed to a clear conclusion, but enough to create doubt. Daniel Carter's timeline, which had once seemed steady, started to show subtle gaps. Minor changes in how events were described, small details that didn't fully align when revisited. On their own, they could be dismissed as memory fading over time, but taken together, they raised questions that couldn't be ignored completely. Mark Reynolds, the close friend who had remained present throughout the early stages of the investigation, also began to draw quiet attention. His behavior shifted in ways that were difficult to define. He was still cooperative, still available when needed, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before, a hesitation in conversations, a reluctance to revisit certain details. Nothing concrete, nothing that could be used as evidence, but enough to leave an impression on those paying close attention. Then there were the financial records. At first glance, they appeared routine, consistent with the life Emily Carter had been living. But a deeper review uncovered transactions that didn't fully make sense, movements of money that didn't match her usual patterns, accounts that had been accessed in ways that raised further questions. Individually, each of these details meant very little, but together, they painted a different picture. One that suggested there was more happening beneath the surface than anyone had initially believed. Despite these developments, the case struggled to move forward. Leads came in, but many led nowhere. An anonymous tip suggested Emily had been seen in another state, living under a different name. Investigators followed up only to find no evidence supporting the claim. There were reported sightings, people convinced they had seen her in public places, each one investigated, each one ultimately unconfirmed. These moments created brief waves of hope, only to fade just as quickly, leaving behind more uncertainty. As time passed, the case settled back into stillness. The unanswered questions remained, but without something tangible to push the investigation forward, there was little that could be done. Emily Carter's disappearance became a memory, something discussed in past tense, something people assumed would never be resolved. Then, more than a decade later, everything changed. At a construction site not far from where Emily had last been seen, workers began clearing ground for a new development. The process was routine, mechanical, nothing out of the ordinary. But during excavation, something unexpected was uncovered. Buried beneath layers of soil, hidden in a place no one had thought to search before, was an object that immediately drew attention: an old phone. Damaged, worn, but still intact enough to be recognized for what it was. It wasn't supposed to be there, and it definitely wasn't supposed to turn on. But when investigators took custody of the device and attempted to access it, something happened that no one anticipated. Despite the years it had spent underground, despite the conditions it had endured, the phone responded. Slowly, unreliably, but enough to reveal that it still held data. And with that possibility came a realization. If this was Emily Carter's phone, then everything about the case was about to change. Because buried inside that device could be the one thing investigators had been missing all along. A direct connection to her final moments. A record of what happened that night. A voice that had been silent for 12 years suddenly given a chance to be heard again. But when they powered it up, they found something no one expected. Then at last the phone revealed its most important secret. One final message sent just minutes before Emily Carter vanished. Simple words but impossible to ignore: "Don't trust him." Those 3 words carried a weight that no one at the time could have understood. They weren't vague or cryptic. They were direct, urgent, and terrifying in their clarity. And the person it referred to wasn't a stranger. It was someone inside the circle of people closest to her. Someone who had been present, someone who had been trusted, someone who had been looking after her all along. As investigators began examining the phone more closely, additional messages were recovered, some deleted, some hidden, some overwritten but retrievable through forensic tools. Each message added a piece to the puzzle, slowly revealing a hidden narrative that no one had anticipated. Emily Carter had been in contact with someone who had known more than the authorities had realized, someone who had tried to help her expose the truth before it was too late. And then came the most shocking revelation. A previously hidden relationship, one that tied directly to the person everyone had relied on to protect her. Evidence began to suggest a motive that was both personal and financial, a combination of betrayal, secrecy, and greed. It became clear that the man leading the search, the calm and composed husband, Daniel Carter, was the very person Emily had been warning against. Every earlier assumption, every detail that had seemed insignificant began to align in a way that no one could have predicted. Conversations that once seemed innocuous took on new meaning. Actions that had gone unquestioned for years suddenly became incriminating. And as the investigation deepened, cracks began to appear in Daniel Carter's carefully constructed story. During formal questioning, the inconsistencies multiplied. Each answer raised new doubts, each hesitation suggested more than what was being said aloud. The calm composure that had once reassured everyone now created tension in the room. Investigators pressed further, exploring financial records, reviewing timelines, and comparing them to Emily's recovered messages. The silence in the room became heavy, almost unbearable. And then, at one critical moment, there was a pause, a long pause, and in that pause the truth began to emerge. Whether it was a full confession or an admission implied by what could no longer be denied, the realization hit like a hammer. Emily Carter had been trying to expose Daniel Carter from the very start, and her warnings had been ignored for 12 long years. The revelation didn't just solve the mystery of her disappearance. It shattered the perception of safety, trust, and reliability that had surrounded Daniel Carter for so long. The story that everyone had believed, the one that seemed so straightforward, was now completely inverted. The emotional impact of that message, simple, urgent, and final, was enormous. It was the moment where the case stopped being just a disappearance and became a story of betrayal, cunning, and heartbreak that would linger in the minds of everyone who followed it. The case was finally closed, but one question still remained. After 12 years of silence, of uncertainty, of a story that never quite made sense, investigators now had something they could point to. A message, a motive, a person responsible. Daniel Carter was no longer seen as the grieving husband who had once stood at the center of the search. Instead, he became the focus of everything Emily Carter had tried to warn about. For many, that should have been the end of it. A conclusion that brought clarity, a resolution that allowed people to move forward. But not everything fit as cleanly as it seemed. Because when forensic analysts took a closer look at the phone, one detail stood out in a way no one could ignore. The timestamp on that final message didn't fully align with the official timeline. It suggested that Emily Carter may have sent that warning earlier than investigators first believed, earlier than the moment her call was cut off, earlier than the point when everything was assumed to have gone wrong. And that raised a different kind of question. If she sent that message before the final moments, then what happened in between? It opened the possibility that Emily Carter had known something was wrong long before that night. That whatever she had discovered wasn't sudden, but something she had been carrying, something she had been trying to process, maybe even trying to escape. And if that was true, then the message recovered from the phone might not have been her final attempt to speak out. It might have been just one of several, the only one that survived, the only one that was ever found. And then there was another possibility, one that investigators couldn't fully confirm but also couldn't completely dismiss. The idea that someone else may have known more than they admitted, that within the circle of people closest to Emily Carter, there may have been information that was never shared, details that were overlooked or perhaps intentionally left out. Because in cases like this, the truth rarely exists in isolation. It moves through people, through conversations, through moments that seem small until they're seen in the right context. Was that really her last message, or just the only one we found? That question lingered even after the case reached its official conclusion. Because while the evidence pointed clearly in one direction, it also hinted at something deeper, something unresolved, a layer of the story that may never be fully understood. What remained undeniable, however, was what this case revealed about trust, about how easily it can be given and how devastating it can be when it's broken. Emily Carter lived a life that from the outside appeared stable, grounded, and safe. But within that life there were truths she may have struggled to confront, signals she tried to send, warnings that weren't recognized until it was too late. Sometimes the truth isn't buried, it's protected, hidden behind familiarity, behind assumptions, behind the belief that the people closest to us are exactly who they appear to be. And when that belief is challenged, it forces a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If you saw the signs, would you have acted sooner? What do you think really happened that night? After everything you've heard, after every detail that slowly came together, does the story feel complete to you, or does it still feel like something is missing? Because even with the discovery of Emily Carter's phone, even with that final message pointing directly at Daniel Carter, there are still moments in this case that don't fully settle. Questions about timing, about what Emily truly knew, and about whether every piece of the truth was ever brought into the light. And that's what makes stories like this stay with us. Not just the answers we find, but the uncertainty that remains. The idea that even when a case is officially closed, it doesn't always mean every question has been answered. Sometimes it just means we've reached the closest version of the truth we can prove. And with Emily Carter's story, that line feels thinner than most. So now it comes down to you, looking at everything, hearing every detail, and knowing how it all unfolded. Do you believe the full truth was uncovered? Or do you think there's still something hidden beneath the surface, something that was never fully revealed? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more real stories with twists like this, stories that challenge what we think we know and reveal how easily things can be hidden in plain sight, subscribe, because the next case might be even more disturbing.